Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, and behind you is everything familiar. The comfortable patterns, the predictable routines, the life you know inside and out. In front of you is open air, endless possibilities, and the terrifying realization that you could become anyone, do anything, go anywhere, and you're frozen. Not because you lack courage, but because the freedom itself is crushing you. This is the paradox no one prepared you for. The very thing you've been told to pursue your entire life, freedom, feels like suffocation when you finally have it. The absence of constraints doesn't liberate you, it paralyzes you. Because when you can do anything, how do you choose what to do? When you can become anyone, who do you become? And when every path is available, how do you know which one is yours? So you stand there, at the edge of infinite possibility, and something strange happens. The anxiety becomes so overwhelming that you start to crave the very thing you spent years trying to escape: the comfort of limitation, the safety of someone else making decisions for you, the relief of not having to choose. Here's what they never told you. Freedom and anxiety are not separate experiences. They are the same experience, viewed from different angles. You cannot have one without the other. And the moment you truly understand this, everything you thought you knew about happiness, success, and personal growth begins to crumble. Think about the last time you had complete freedom. A blank weekend, a career transition, a relationship ending, a moment when the script you'd been following suddenly disappeared. How did it feel? If you're honest, probably not the way freedom is supposed to feel. Probably more like vertigo, like standing in an empty room where the walls keep expanding and you keep shrinking. Because freedom without direction is just chaos. Freedom without meaning is just noise. And freedom without the willingness to tolerate anxiety is just another word for being lost. But here's where it gets more disturbing. Most people never experience real freedom because they've unconsciously constructed elaborate prisons to protect themselves from it. They choose careers that exhaust them so completely that they never have to ask what they actually want. They fill every moment with distraction, so they never have to sit with the question of who they are when no one's watching. They adopt other people's definitions of success, so they never have to define it for themselves. They mistake their prison for safety, and they mistake safety for happiness. You do this too. You know you do. There are dreams you don't pursue, not because you can't, but because pursuing them would mean confronting the terrifying possibility that you might fail, or worse, that you might succeed, and discover that even your dreams can't save you from the fundamental anxiety of existence. So you stay in the job that's killing your soul, because at least you know what each day will bring. You stay in the relationship that's more habit than love, because at least you're not alone with yourself. You stay in the city, the routine, the story you've been telling about who you are, because changing any of it would mean admitting a devastating truth, that you've been choosing comfort over aliveness, security over growth, the familiar ache over the unknown possibility. And every day you make this choice, a part of you dies. Not dramatically, not noticeably, but the person you could have become, the one standing on the other side of your fear, grows fainter and fainter until it's just a ghost, haunting the edges of your awareness at 3 a.m. Here's the question that should terrify you. What if the anxiety you're running from isn't a sign that something's wrong? What if it's a sign that something's right? What if anxiety is the price of admission to a life that actually matters, and by avoiding it, you're avoiding life itself? Consider this carefully. Every major transition in your life, every moment of real growth, was preceded by anxiety. Learning to walk meant falling repeatedly. Learning to connect meant risking rejection. Learning anything meant embracing the discomfort of incompetence. You instinctively understood this as a child. You reached for things beyond your grasp. You tried and failed and tried again, without the crippling self-consciousness that now stops you before you even start. But somewhere along the way, you learned a terrible lesson: that anxiety is the enemy. That discomfort means you're doing something wrong. That the goal of life is to minimize fear rather than to build the capacity to carry it. So you optimized for comfort. You engineered a life designed to produce the least amount of friction, the smallest amount of uncertainty, the most predictable outcomes. And you called this wisdom. You called this maturity. You called this success. But what if you were wrong? What if the entire framework is inverted? What if freedom isn't the absence of anxiety, but the willingness to feel it and move forward anyway? What if growth isn't about becoming more comfortable, but about expanding your capacity to be uncomfortable? What if the life you're protecting yourself from, the one that terrifies you, is the only one worth living? And here's the most unsettling question of all. What if you already know this? What if, beneath all the justifications and rationalizations and carefully constructed excuses, you already know that you're choosing a slow death over a vibrant life? What if the quiet desperation you feel isn't depression or burnout or any clinical condition at all, but simply your soul's recognition that you're betraying your own potential? How much longer can you sustain the lie that you're waiting for the right time when you absolutely know, that the right time is a myth you tell yourself to avoid the truth that there is only this time, this moment, this choice between anxiety that leads to growth and comfort that leads to decay? The price of freedom is anxiety, but the price of avoiding that anxiety might be your entire life. So which price are you willing to pay? To understand why freedom feels like terror, you need to go back to 1946, to a lecture hall in Paris, where Jean-Paul Sartre stood before a crowd and delivered one of the most disturbing philosophical proclamations of the modern era. Man is condemned to be free. Condemned. Not blessed. Not gifted. Condemned. Sartre understood something that most self-help gurus conveniently ignore. Freedom is not a prize to be won or a destination to reach. It's a burden to be carried. Because with absolute freedom comes absolute responsibility. Every choice you make, or fail to make, is yours alone. You cannot blame your circumstances, your upbringing, your genetics, or the universe. You are, in Sartre's terms, radically free. And that radical freedom is precisely what makes existence so unbearable. When you choose one path, you simultaneously unchoose infinite others. When you commit to becoming one version of yourself, you kill all the other versions you might have been. And you have to do this constantly, moment by moment, decision by decision, knowing that there's no cosmic script, no predetermined destiny, no external authority that can tell you whether you're choosing correctly. You are alone with your freedom. And that aloneness is the source of what Sartre called existential anguish. But it gets worse. Because your brain, this 3-pound organ that evolved over millions of years to keep you alive on the African savanna, was never designed to handle this level of autonomy. Your ancestors didn't agonize over career choices or question their life's purpose. They lived within tightly defined social structures where roles were predetermined, choices were limited, and meaning was inherited from the tribe. Your brain is still wired for that world. It craves clear hierarchies, defined roles, and external validation of your choices. It wants someone or something to tell you that you're doing it right, that you're on the correct path, that your life has meaning. And when that external validation doesn't come, when you're confronted with the reality that there is no correct path, No objective measure of a life well lived, no authority who can confirm you're not wasting your existence. Your brain does what it does best. It panics. This is anxiety. Not the clinical kind, necessarily, but the existential kind. The kind that German philosopher Martin Heidegger called Angst, a fundamental unease that arises from confronting the groundlessness of existence itself. Heidegger crucially distinguished between fear and anxiety. Fear has an object. You're afraid of something specific, a lion, a failure, a rejection. But anxiety has no object. It's a generalized dread that emerges when you confront the sheer fact of your existence, your freedom, your responsibility to create meaning in a universe that offers no inherent meaning. And here's the trap. Your brain, encountering this objectless anxiety, desperately searches for something to attach it to. So it creates objects. You become anxious about your career, your relationships, your finances, and your health. You transform existential anxiety into specific fears because specific fears can be addressed, managed, and controlled. But the relief never lasts because the underlying anxiety, the one generated by your radical freedom, remains untouched. So you solve one problem and immediately find another to worry about. You optimize your life in 1,000 small ways, but the background hum of unease never disappears. This is what psychologist Rollo May called the dilemma of modern man. We have more freedom than any humans in history, and we have no idea what to do with it. Your great-grandparents didn't wonder if they were living their authentic truth. They didn't agonize over whether their career aligned with their passion. They survived. They endured. They lived within constraints so tight that questions of meaning and purpose were almost absurd luxuries. But you have options. Endless options. You can reinvent yourself with a new haircut and a plane ticket. You can learn anything on the internet. You can connect with people across the globe. You can be anyone, go anywhere, do anything. And it's destroying you. Because of the paradox of choice, as psychologist Barry Schwartz demonstrated, is that more options don't make you happier. They make you more anxious, more paralyzed, more convinced that whatever you choose, you're missing out on something better. Carl Jung approached this from another angle, recognizing that modern anxiety often stems from what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, separate from the collective identity of family, culture, and society. Individuation is necessary for psychological wholeness, but it's also terrifying because it requires you to stand alone, to differentiate yourself from the herd, to trust your inner voice even when it contradicts every external message. Most people, Jung observed, avoid individuation. They remain unconsciously identified with collective values, living out scripts written by others, never asking whether the life they're living is actually theirs. And they pay for this avoidance with a vague sense of meaninglessness, a persistent feeling that something essential is missing even when everything appears fine on the surface. This is the hidden problem at the heart of the anxiety growth paradox. You're caught between two equally uncomfortable truths. On one side is the terror of freedom, the anguish of choosing without guarantees, the responsibility of creating your own meaning, the loneliness of standing in your authentic self. On the other side is the slow suffocation of conformity, the death of potential, the betrayal of your deepest values, the gradual realization that you've spent your entire life living someone else's dream. Both paths involve suffering. The question is, which suffering is generative and which is merely corrosive? Friedrich Nietzsche understood this distinction deeply. He spoke of two types of people: those who say yes to life in all its difficulty, who embrace suffering as the price of becoming, who would willingly live their exact life over and over for eternity, and those who say no to life, who seek comfort and security above all else, who spend their existence avoiding pain rather than creating meaning. Nietzsche called the first path Amor Fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but active affirmation. The willingness to embrace every challenge, every setback, every moment of anxiety as necessary ingredients in the alchemy of becoming who you are meant to be. But here's what makes this so difficult. Growth requires you to step into anxiety deliberately. It requires you to choose the unknown over the known, the uncomfortable over the comfortable, the challenging over the easy. And every instinct you have, every evolutionary imperative hardwired into your nervous system, is screaming at you to do the opposite. Your amygdala, the ancient part of your brain responsible for detecting threats, can't distinguish between actual danger and perceived social risk. It treats the possibility of embarrassment with the same urgency as a predator attack. So when you consider doing something that might lead to growth, speaking up in a meeting, pursuing a creative project, ending a comfortable but dead relationship, your brain floods you with the same stress hormones it would release if you were being chased by a tiger. And you, not understanding that this response is a feature of your biology rather than an accurate assessment of danger, interpret the anxiety as a warning sign. You think, this feels wrong, therefore it must be wrong. You mistake the discomfort of growth for the pain of harm. This is the mechanism that keeps you trapped, not external circumstances, not lack of opportunity, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what anxiety actually signals. What if anxiety isn't a stop sign? What if it's a compass, pointing toward exactly the places you need to go to evolve? What if the things that make you most uncomfortable are precisely the experiences that will expand you beyond your current limitations? And what if you've spent your entire life running from the very feeling that was trying to guide you toward your most authentic life? So you've been choosing comfort, day after day, year after year. You've been selecting the path of least resistance, and you've told yourself it's temporary. You've told yourself you're being strategic, prudent, and realistic. You're waiting for the right moment. You're building a foundation. You're being responsible. But something's happening beneath the surface of your awareness, something far more sinister than you realize. Every time you choose comfort over growth, you're not just maintaining the status quo. You're actively training your nervous system to avoid discomfort. You're strengthening neural pathways that equate safety with stagnation. You're teaching your brain, at the deepest biological level, that anxiety is an enemy to be defeated rather than a signal to be heeded. And your brain is an exceptional student. It learns this lesson perfectly. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repeated experience, is often celebrated as one of humanity's greatest assets. It's how you learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But neuroplasticity doesn't care about your long-term flourishing. It simply reinforces whatever you practice most. And what have you been practicing? Avoidance, retreat, the systematic elimination of situations that might trigger anxiety. Each time you stay silent when you should speak up, your brain notes. Speaking up equals danger. Silence equals safety. Each time you choose the familiar over the novel, your neural pathways deepen the groove. Known equals survival. Unknown equals threat. Each time you rationalize why now isn't the right time to take that risk, your psychological immune system becomes more sophisticated at generating justifications for inaction. You're becoming an expert at your own imprisonment. And the truly terrifying part? The process is so gradual that you don't notice your world shrinking until you're standing in a space so small you can barely breathe. This is what psychologists call experiential avoidance. the attempt to avoid thoughts, feelings, memories, or physical sensations that cause discomfort, even when doing so creates long-term harm. And research consistently shows that experiential avoidance is one of the primary drivers of psychological suffering. The equation is brutally simple. The more you avoid anxiety, the more anxious you become. Because avoidance teaches your brain that the thing you're avoiding is genuinely dangerous. Each time you sidestep discomfort, you confirm to your nervous system that you were right to be afraid, which makes you more afraid next time, which increases the likelihood you'll avoid it again. It's a death spiral masquerading as self-care, and the consequences ripple outward in ways you're only beginning to recognize. Your relationships become shallower because real intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability triggers anxiety. So you keep people at arm's length, sharing carefully curated versions of yourself, while the real you, messy, uncertain, longing, remains hidden even from those who claim to love you. You notice that conversations stay surface level, that connections feel transactional, that even surrounded by people, you feel profoundly alone. But you don't connect this loneliness to your avoidance of the anxiety that authentic connection requires. Your career flatlines because advancement requires risk, the risk of failure, of visibility, of being evaluated and potentially found wanting. So you stay in roles where you're competent but unchallenged, where you can perform your duties in your sleep, where the days blur together in a haze of comfortable mediocrity. You tell yourself you're being strategic, building expertise, waiting for the right opportunity. But years pass, and the opportunities never seem quite right. And one day, you wake up and realize you've become the person who talks about what they're going to do someday while doing nothing today. Your creativity atrophies because creation requires you to produce something that might be judged, criticized, or ignored. The anxiety of putting your work into the world becomes unbearable, so you keep it locked inside, telling yourself you're perfecting it, when really you're protecting yourself from the possibility that your creations, extensions of your inner world, might be rejected. And with each passing year, the gap widens between who you are and who you're capable of becoming. The unlived life piles up like unpaid debt, and the interest compounds silently in the background of your psyche. You develop what researchers call a fixed mindset, the belief that your abilities, intelligence, and potential are static rather than expandable. This isn't something you consciously choose. It's the inevitable result of systematically avoiding the challenges that would prove your capacity for growth. Because here's what happens. Growth requires failure. It requires attempting things you're not yet good at, making mistakes, looking foolish, and confronting the limits of your current abilities. But if you've spent years avoiding anxiety, you've also spent years avoiding situations where you might fail. And without failure, you have no evidence that you can overcome challenges. So your self-concept calcifies around the person you already are, rather than expanding to include the person you might become. Meanwhile, at the societal level, you're being sold a dangerous lie. That happiness equals the absence of negative emotions. That a good life is a comfortable life. That if you're anxious, something must be wrong. With you? With your circumstances? With your brain chemistry? This cultural narrative is reinforced everywhere you look. Pharmaceutical companies profit from medicalizing normal human anxiety. Social media presents carefully filtered lives devoid of struggle or uncertainty. Self-help culture promises techniques to eliminate discomfort rather than build the capacity to carry it. And you, marinating in these messages, come to believe that your anxiety is aberrant, that other people have figured out how to live without this gnawing discomfort, that if you could just find the right meditation app, the right morning routine, the right combination of supplements and positive affirmations, you too could achieve the frictionless existence that everyone else seems to enjoy. But they don't. They're just as anxious as you are. They're just better at hiding it, or they've numbed themselves so effectively they've forgotten what aliveness even feels like. The truth is this: we're living in the most materially abundant, physically safe era in human history, and we're more anxious than ever. Because we've solved most of the external threats, predators, starvation, disease, but we haven't addressed the internal one, the existential weight of radical freedom. Your ancestors faced genuine dangers, but they also had clear purpose. Survival provided built-in meaning. Community provided identity. Tradition provided direction. You have none of these certainties, and instead of embracing the anxiety that comes with creating your own meaning, you've been taught to pathologize it. So you accumulate coping mechanisms, substances to numb the edges, distractions to fill the void, achievements to prove your worth to an audience you've internalized but can never satisfy. You become a master of impression management, carefully constructing a persona that appears successful, put together, and enviable. But inside, you're dissolving. The gap between your public presentation and your private experience becomes so vast that you start to feel like a fraud. Psychologists call this imposter syndrome, but it's not really about competence. It's about the exhaustion of maintaining a false self while your true self languishes in darkness. And here's the cruelest consequence of all. The longer you avoid growth-inducing anxiety, the more terrifying it becomes. The challenges that would have been manageable at 25 feel insurmountable at 35. The risks you could have taken before responsibilities accumulated feel impossible now. The person you might have become recedes further into the territory of fantasy until it feels like a completely different life, rather than a different version of this one. You look at people who took the risks you didn't, who pursued the uncertain path, who bet on themselves, who chose anxiety over comfort, and you feel a complex mixture of admiration, envy, and bitter rationalization. They got lucky, you tell yourself. They didn't have my responsibilities. They don't understand what it's like to have real constraints. But deep down, in the part of yourself you work very hard not to examine, you know the truth. They just chose differently. They felt the same fear and did it anyway. They paid the price of anxiety and received growth in return, while you paid the price of comfort and received only more comfort, which you're now discovering isn't comfort at all, but a kind of slow-motion suffocation, a life that's safe and small and utterly insufficient to the magnitude of what you actually are. The question you can no longer avoid is this: how much longer can you sustain this? How many more years can you wake up and perform this elaborate charade of contentment while something essential inside you screams for release? How much of your potential are you willing to sacrifice on the altar of avoiding discomfort? And what will you tell yourself in 10 years when you're still in the same place, still planning to start living once the conditions are perfect, still waiting for an anxiety-free moment that will never arrive? Here's the shift that changes everything. Stop trying to eliminate anxiety. Start using it as fuel. This isn't some motivational platitude. This is a fundamental reorientation of your relationship with discomfort that rewrites the entire equation. Because the problem was never the anxiety itself. The problem was your belief that anxiety signifies something wrong, something to be fixed, something that disqualifies you from moving forward. What if anxiety is actually the most reliable sign that you're doing something right? Think about it. When do you feel anxious? When you're expanding beyond your current identity. When you're attempting something that matters enough to fail at. When you're stepping into the unknown territory, where growth actually lives. Anxiety doesn't appear when you're stagnating in your comfort zone. It appears precisely at the threshold between who you are and who you're becoming. It's not a warning to retreat. It's a confirmation that you're at the edge. The people who achieve extraordinary things, who create, who build, who contribute, aren't less anxious than you. They're just more willing to interpret anxiety differently. They've learned to recognize it as the admission price to a meaningful life, rather than a sign they're on the wrong path. Consider the writer who feels nauseating dread every time they sit down to work. That anxiety doesn't mean they should stop writing. It means the work matters so much that the possibility of failure carries real weight. The entrepreneur launching a venture feels terror because success would fundamentally alter their identity. An identity change is one of the most destabilizing experiences the human psyche can undergo. The person ending a dead relationship feels crushing anxiety, not because they're making a mistake, but because they're killing the version of themselves who stayed small and safe. This is the rebellion, choosing to move toward anxiety rather than away from it. But this requires a complete inversion of everything your nervous system has learned. It requires you to develop what psychologists call distress tolerance, the capacity to experience discomfort without immediately rushing to eliminate it. And this capacity isn't something you're born with or without. It's something you build, repetition by repetition, like a muscle. Here's how it works. You start small, deliberately small. You identify something that triggers mild anxiety, a conversation you've been avoiding, a creative project you've been postponing, a social invitation that feels uncomfortable. And instead of rationalizing why you shouldn't do it, you do it specifically because it makes you anxious. You're not doing it to achieve any particular outcome. You're doing it to prove to your nervous system that anxiety isn't dangerous, that you can feel the discomfort and survive it, that the catastrophe your brain is predicting doesn't actually materialize. This is exposure therapy, but you're administering it to yourself. And what neuroscience shows is remarkable. When you repeatedly expose yourself to anxiety-provoking situations and nothing terrible happens, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, begins to recalibrate. It learns that the thing you were avoiding isn't actually threatening. The neural pathways connecting that situation to danger begin to weaken, while new pathways connecting it to capability begin to strengthen. You're literally rewiring your brain's threat detection system. But here's what makes this truly transformative. Each time you move toward anxiety instead of away from it, you're not just building tolerance, you're expanding your identity. You're proving to yourself that you're the kind of person who does hard things. And identity is the deepest lever of behavior change. James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, describes this as identity-based change. Most people try to change behaviors while maintaining the same self-concept. They say, "I want to write," while still thinking of themselves as not a writer. The dissonance between behavior and identity creates enormous internal resistance. But when you repeatedly do things that scare you, your identity begins to shift at the foundational level. You stop being someone who wants to be brave and start being someone who acts despite fear. That distinction changes everything, because now the anxiety-inducing action isn't a deviation from who you are. It's a confirmation of it. The Stoic philosophers understood this deeply. Epictetus taught his students to practice voluntary discomfort, sleeping on hard surfaces, eating simple food, enduring cold, not out of masochism, but as training. He recognized that the capacity to endure discomfort is the foundation of freedom. Because once you know you can handle hardship, you stop being controlled by the fear of it. Marcus Aurelius, arguably the most powerful man in the ancient world, wrote in his private journals, You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wasn't saying you can control whether you feel anxiety. He was saying you can control whether anxiety controls you. This is the rebellion at its core, reclaiming sovereignty over your response to discomfort. But it requires you to abandon one of the most seductive narratives modern culture offers: that you deserve to feel good all the time. That if something feels difficult, you're doing it wrong. That struggle is a sign of inadequacy rather than growth. The truth is far less comfortable. Meaningful things are difficult. Creating something that matters requires you to tolerate extended periods of uncertainty and self-doubt. Building genuine relationships requires you to risk rejection and practice vulnerability. Developing mastery in any domain requires thousands of hours of frustrated incompetence. There is no path to a significant life that doesn't run directly through anxiety. The only question is whether you're willing to pay that price. And here's what happens when you are. You discover that the anxiety you've been running from your entire life is actually finite. It has a peak. You feel it rising, your heart racing, your thoughts spiraling, and then it crests. It doesn't destroy you. It doesn't last forever. It's just a temporary physiological state, a cascade of neurochemicals that your body metabolizes and releases. The more you experience this, the more you realize that anxiety is just a sensation. Uncomfortable, yes, but not unbearable, not dangerous. Just a feeling moving through your body, trying to protect you from perceived threats that mostly don't exist. And once you understand this experientially, not intellectually, but in your bones, anxiety loses its power over you. You stop organizing your entire life around avoiding it. You stop treating it as an emergency requiring immediate resolution. You learn to say, "Oh, there's anxiety. That means I'm doing something that matters. I'll let it be here while I do what I need to do." This is what psychologists call acceptance and commitment therapy, the practice of accepting your internal experience without trying to change it while committing to actions aligned with your values. It's revolutionary because it disconnects feeling from action. You don't have to feel brave to act bravely. You don't have to feel confident to do confident things. You just have to be willing to carry the discomfort while you move forward. Viktor Frankl, who endured the Nazi concentration camps and emerged to develop logotherapy, taught that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is your power to choose your response. The stimulus, anxiety, is often unavoidable, but your response, whether you let it stop you or carry it with you, is always a choice. The rebellion is choosing growth, again and again, in small ways and large. Not because it feels good, but because it creates the kind of person whose life reflects their deepest values rather than their deepest fears. And the remarkable thing? Once you start making this choice consistently, you discover that the life on the other side of anxiety, the one you've been avoiding, was the life you wanted all along. The anxiety was just the doorway you were too afraid to walk through. So walk through it. Today. Not when you feel ready. You'll never feel ready. Not when the anxiety subsides. It won't. Not until you prove you don't need it to. But now, while your hands are shaking and your mind is generating 1,000 reasons to wait. Because the only thing more terrifying than facing your anxiety is reaching the end of your life and realizing you let it make all your decisions for you. Here's the truth that recontextualizes everything. Anxiety and growth aren't opposing forces you have to balance. They're the same force, experienced at different stages of integration. What you've been calling anxiety is actually your system responding to expansion. It's the psychological equivalent of muscle fiber tearing during exercise. Uncomfortable, yes, but necessary for growth. Your psyche is stretching beyond its current parameters, and the discomfort you feel isn't a malfunction. It's the feeling of becoming. Think about a snake shedding its skin. The process is undoubtedly uncomfortable, probably disorienting. The old skin that once fit perfectly now constricts. The snake could try to hold on to it, could resist the natural expansion of its body. But that resistance would be fatal. Growth isn't optional. Only the willingness to feel the discomfort of it is. You are always shedding an old self and growing into a new one. Always. The anxiety you feel is the friction of that transformation. And when you resist it, when you cling to the identity that no longer fits, you don't prevent the anxiety. You just prolong it indefinitely. This is the ultimate paradox. The only way to reduce anxiety in the long term is to increase it deliberately in the short term. The only way to feel safe is to repeatedly prove to yourself that you can handle being unsafe. The only way to find peace is to make friends with discomfort. Every spiritual tradition has recognized this truth in different languages. The Buddhists speak of the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain of existence, unavoidable. The second arrow is your resistance to that pain, and this is where suffering multiplies. Christians talk about dying to self, the necessary destruction of the ego-driven identity to make room for something transcendent. The ancient mystery schools required initiates to face their deepest fears in darkness before emerging into light. They all understood. Transformation requires a kind of death. The death of who you were. The death of your illusions about who you should be. The death of the stories you've told yourself about your limitations. And death, even psychological death, is terrifying. Your ego, the construct of self that's been running your life, correctly perceives growth as a threat to its existence. Because growth does threaten it. Every time you expand beyond your current identity, you're killing a version of yourself. But here's what makes this bearable, even beautiful. You're not being destroyed. You're being transformed. The you that emerges on the other side of anxiety-driven growth isn't a different person. It's a more complete version of who you've always been. It's you with layers of protective limitation stripped away. It's you meeting your own potential. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage." Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. What if your anxiety is the princess? What if the very thing you've been running from is actually calling you toward your most authentic self? What if the discomfort isn't punishment, but an invitation? Consider how different your life would look if you operated from this understanding. If every time you felt anxiety, instead of asking, "What's wrong?" you asked, "What's trying to emerge?" If instead of treating discomfort as a problem to solve, you treated it as information about where your growth edge is, you'd stop waiting to feel ready. You'd recognize that readiness is a myth, that the only way to become capable is to act before you feel capable. You'd stop interpreting nervousness as inadequacy and start seeing it as the natural response to attempting something meaningful. You'd pursue the relationship that terrifies you, because the terror indicates depth of feeling worth exploring. You'd launch the project that makes your hands shake, because the shaking confirms it matters. You'd have the conversation you've been avoiding, because the avoidance itself reveals its importance. Your entire life would reorganize around a single principle. Move toward what makes you anxious, because that's where your unlived life is waiting. And here's what you'd discover. Most of what you've been afraid of isn't actually that hard once you're doing it. The anticipatory anxiety is almost always worse than the experience itself. Your mind catastrophizes, imagines devastating outcomes, and plays out worst-case scenarios on repeat. But when you actually step into the feared situation, you find you have resources you didn't know you had. You find you're more resilient than you believed. You find that failure isn't fatal and embarrassment isn't permanent. You find, again and again, that the stories you told yourself about your limitations were just stories. And stories can be rewritten. This is the final realization. You've never been trapped by your circumstances. You've been trapped by your unwillingness to feel uncomfortable in the process of changing them. The cage was never locked. You just convinced yourself the bars were solid when they were only suggestions. Every single thing you want, the career that feels aligned, the relationships that nourish you, the creative expression that makes you feel alive, the sense that you're living your actual life rather than a pale imitation of it, exists on the other side of temporary discomfort. Not someday. Not when conditions are perfect. Now. Today. In the next decision you make, you can choose anxiety that leads to expansion, or you can choose comfort that leads to contraction. But you cannot choose both. You cannot grow and stay the same. You cannot discover what you're capable of while protecting yourself from ever feeling inadequate. You cannot build a life that matters while avoiding everything difficult. The price of freedom is anxiety. But what you're receiving in exchange isn't just growth, it's your actual life. The one you'll look back on without regret. The one where you said yes to possibility instead of no to discomfort. The one where you became the person your potential was always calling you to be. So here's your choice, right now, in this moment. Will you continue organizing your life around the avoidance of anxiety, gradually shrinking into a smaller and smaller version of yourself until you're unrecognizable even to your own soul? Or will you recognize that the discomfort you feel isn't a stop sign, but a starting line? That the racing heart and sweating palms and spiraling thoughts aren't evidence of danger, but proof that you're finally stepping into the arena where your real life is waiting? The truth is, you already know what you need to do. You've always known. There's a risk you haven't taken, a conversation you haven't had, a dream you haven't pursued. And every day you wake up, it's there, whispering from the shadows of your awareness. Stop waiting for it to feel easy. It won't. Stop waiting to feel ready. You won't. Stop waiting for permission from the universe or a sign or the perfect moment. Just decide that the temporary discomfort of growth is a worthwhile price to pay for the permanent expansion of becoming who you actually are. And then step forward into it, shaking, uncertain, afraid, but moving. Because in the end, freedom isn't the absence of anxiety. It's the willingness to carry it with you as you build the life that anxiety was trying to protect you from. The life so meaningful, so authentic, so fully yours that looking back, you will understand why it required everything you had to create it. The price of freedom is anxiety, but the cost of comfort is your soul. Choose wisely. Choose now. Choose growth. Your life is waiting.